3 weeks ahead of pivotal parliamentary elections here in Armenia, we are presenting to you The Angle. Today is Monday, April 16th, and I am joined by Richard Giragosian, Director of the Regional Studies Center in Yerevan. And one of the great things, whenever we get the chance to speak with you, is we get to hear about all the ways you're representing this region and the various places you're seeing. So start by telling us where you've been recently, and what's the world saying about Armenia?
Well, good question. Actually, my most recent trip was very close. It was Tbilisi, the Georgian capital. But what was interesting was I attended two events. One was an Eastern Partnership Forum, of which Armenia is one of 6 post-Soviet states, engaged in deeper integration with the European Union. The second event was Wilton Park, which is a British Foreign Office event, looking at the region as a whole. In Tbilisi, we were joined not only by delegations from Baku and Tbilisi, but a number of European Union officials. And in that regard, what is most interesting is the Armenian elections are significant for many reasons, and I'm sure we'll cover that. But what's most important or interesting is the Armenian parliamentary elections is the first in a series of wider regional elections. For example, we have parliamentary and presidential elections within this year and next year in Georgia and Azerbaijan. Armenia's election, as the first in this regional cycle, will represent a test not only of Armenia's commitment to democracy, but also a test of the international community's response to the handling and conduct of this election.
So you're saying it's a litmus test. What specific issues are we anticipating? Are we concerned about?
Well, I'm very concerned, to be honest, because in many ways, this election is different than any other. In other words, this is the first national election since the crucial and actually destabilizing post-election violence and conflict of March 2008. It's also the first election in this broader new political reality. But in many ways, it's not only a new test of the Armenian government, it's also an opportunity to actually go beyond and resolve the internal conflict. But what worries me and what is of serious concern is we don't see much to reassure or to reinforce the government's promises and pledges of a much improved election. And in this way, I'm worried that it's going to be an opportunity that is lost.
It's interesting that you say that, because I have heard people say that, you know, obviously 2008 was so bad, so maybe we're taking from such a bad example, but this should be the, quote, cleanest election we've had in a while. You don't agree?
Well, no, I don't. In other words, theoretically it should be. But the 2008 election that triggered the post-election polarization was a presidential election. This is an opportunity to elect a new parliament reflecting a new face of Armenian political reality. And what worries me is we see more of the same. We see a return of the so-called oligarchs as deputies, which actually limit the effectiveness of the new parliament. But what's interesting, we also see something new and something different. And in this sense, there is hope and optimism. In other words, this is no longer the traditional conflict or political confrontation between the opposition and the government. Rather, the conflict is within the ruling elite, within the coalition between Republican Party and Prosperous Armenia, the junior member of the coalition. So what this is really about is a struggle within the political elite. The reason this is hopeful is because this new conflict may be sufficient as an agent of change for forcing open the closed political system, where politics for too long in this country have been dominated by personality over policy.
Interesting. I'm going to fill in a little bit for our audience. What he's referring to is the Prosperous Armenia Party, which is headed by a man, I'll say it, considered by many to be one of, if not the biggest oligarch in the country, named Gagik Zadukyan. And then the Republican Party is loaded with many people who would fall into that category, but now what you have is a real battle between the two, potentially. There is, of course, the skeptical side that says all this is a different name on the same policy issues going forward. What makes you think that platform and issues is actually important this time around?
Well, in one sense, the cynicism is a necessity. In terms of being realistic, both the Republican Party and Prosperous Armenia are members of the ruling coalition, representing vested interests in the continuation of the system. However, what's new this time and what makes the conflict much more real is the decision by the Republican Party to actually significantly weaken Prosperous Armenia. And we see a real conflict that has manifested even in election-related violence between youth wings of the parties in Gyumri, Amavir, and other areas.
That stuff is going on outside of Yerevan and kind of not at the highest level. Explain to our viewers a little bit more what is actually happening in those
Well, what
instances.
we see is it's not the first nor the last time, but we see clashes between rival groups of supporters and youth wings of each of these two parties. And we see it not only in the regions, but even during Yerevan's municipal elections, we saw a similar spate of clashes and confrontation. This is also reaffirmation of how deep and how divisive this conflict is going. What's also interesting, in a broader sense, Armenian politics today is actually defined by three people. The first, the former, and the current president. In other words, within this scope, in this definition, what's interesting is the first president, Levon Ter-Petrosyan, leader of the opposition, has actually formed a tactical alliance with the current president, Serge Sargsyan, based on the common threat or perceived threat from former President Robert Kocharian, who is widely seen as the backer or beneficiary of the prosperous Armenia party. So in many ways, this is also a deeper rivalry between current President Sargsyan and former President Kocharian.
However, publicly, the Armenian National Congress, Levon Ter-Petrosyan's party, is saying that they're going after the Republicans, no?
Yes, they are, but it's the same party that entered into a dialogue with the government. It's the same party that many expect and is widely seen to be able to enter the parliament and win a number of seats. The tactics and strategy of Ter-Petrosyan's opposition has changed, and in effect probably has changed to the better, because one thing that's needed that was missing before is the need to engage in the system. In other words, during the municipal elections in Yerevan, the Armenian National Congress of Ter-Petrosyan won a number of seats in municipal government, yet decided to boycott, claiming that the government was illegitimate. This I can understand from an emotional point of view, but it's not very good politically. To refuse to engage in the political system does not really help the country. And in this sense, this has changed, where we should expect a new opposition force within the Armenian parliament.
So that's a positive in your view?
Theoretically, yes, and in general terms, sure. The more of a level playing field, the more pluralistic the political landscape, the better. My criticism of everybody is that we don't see a debate over policies or issues, but a clash between personalities and powerful interest groups.
Yeah, at what point will we get to that? I mean, you know, there is this thought out there that the Dashnag party does have a legitimate platform. But aside from that, it feels like a lot of the same old. When will we get to the point where it's platform, it's issue, it's debates, it's that?
Well, I think we're past the stage for waiting. In other words, we're really at a term or a period of a crisis of confidence, where if this election in particular is not significantly better, there's a combination of two factors that may seriously undermine stability in this country. One is higher internal expectations among the population. Armenia since 2008 is no longer the same society. Sure. Apathy is much less, expectations are much higher. At the same time—
Does that also mean frustration is much higher?
Of course. Much of the frustration and discontent is also rooted in mounting socioeconomic inequalities, disparities of wealth and income, which are more important, more serious challenges than a political stalemate. But the second factor that's adding pressure is greater international scrutiny. In other words, this opportunity, if Armenia misses it, will have a price to pay. In other words, in terms of Armenia's deeper integration with the European Union and the future of Armenia.
Yeah, and that's exacerbated by what you said in the beginning of this, that we are the first in what will be multiple elections. We plan to bring you on again to get more of a direct prediction as we get closer, but let's finish with this. As we move towards, we're about 20 days away now from the election, kind of horse race type stuff, what trends are we starting to see?
Well, we see one trend, and that is mounting and much more obvious confrontation and conflict within the elite, between the Republican Party, the country's largest, and the number 2 party in the country, Prosperous Armenia. We see that conflict is beginning to define the pre-election period. At the same time, we see increasingly more of an unlevel playing field prior to election day in terms of media coverage, in terms of campaigning. This is very dangerous, and also a demonstration
that... It's basically two parties that have some control over advertising and that. Is that what you're saying?
Well, even more than that. We see slanted media coverage, let alone airtime. We also see a rather deeper trend toward basically resorting to the same old tactics of voter intimidation, buying votes, with little sign of a positive trend of preparing for what should be a much improved election.
Richard Giragosian, thank you so much for being with us. It's so much to think about. We'll be following the next 20 days very carefully, and it's interesting to know that the rest of the region will be following it so carefully because we are the first. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.